I would like to join my colleagues and people all across the world in expressing my condolences to the people of South Africa on the passing of their great leader, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela ended his extraordinary autobiography entitled Long Walk to Freedom with these words, and I quote him, "I have walked that long road to freedom. I've tried not to falter. I've made missteps along the way. But I've discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I've taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I've come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended." Sadly, President Nelson Mandela's long walk and his noble life are indeed now ended, but his influence on the world will endure for a long time to come. The editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post put it, Nelson Mandela was, quote, larger than life and death. Through enormous strength of character and a determination unlike many people in this world, Nelson Mandela helped his beloved South Africa to end the vicious system of apartheid and begin a new walk toward multiracial democracy. His dream, he often said, was that South Africa would become a rainbow nation at peace with itself and with the world. Nelson Mandela astonished the world with his capacity to forgive, even to forgive those who jailed him and persecuted his family. There was an interview on television that I saw yesterday morning on ABC, in which Nelson Mandela spoke about his imprisonment shortly after he'd been released. He'd spent 27 years in prison, part of it on Robben Island, which I've had the opportunity to visit, to actually stand in Nelson Mandela's tiny cell. It is an island off of Cape Town. The waters around it are shark-infested so that prisoners won't try to escape from that island. They can just barely make out the land mass away from that island, but they are separated on this piece of land in the middle of this ocean. And there he lived for almost 25 years. There he lived in this cell, many times in isolation. He labored in a quarry nearby, which we visited, and the sunlight bouncing off of the rocks in that quarry virtually blinded him for the rest of his life. He wore sunglasses and begged the photographers not to use flashbulbs the rest of his life because of the damage that had been done to his eyes. The prisoners in Robben Island, many of them sharing his political philosophy in opposing apartheid, tried to create what they called a university atmosphere where they taught one another all that they could remember and all that they knew. They devoured information from the outside world in an effort to try to keep in touch with what was going on. In this interview, as he was released from this imprisonment, Nelson Mandela was asked by the interviewer about his warden and his guard at the prison. He talked about the deep emotional ties they developed, how this guard that he came to know, I believe his name was Gregory, was a real gentleman, in the words of Nelson Mandela, and how when Mandela was finally released, there was a moment of emotion as they knew that they would part after all these years of such a close relationship. I recall that story because so many times when I've given commencement addresses, I've used as an example Nelson Mandela's decision when elected president of South Africa to invite that guard from his prison to be there as one of his honored guests at his inauguration as president of South Africa. That to me speaks volumes. Nelson Mandela taught us powerful lessons about justice, tolerance, and reconciliation. As the first democratically elected president of South Africa, Mandela was the father of a new nation. Like George Washington, the father of our nation, he chose consciously, deliberately, to walk away from power. In doing so, he reminded us that peaceful, orderly transition of power is one of the hallmarks of a real democracy. Nelson Mandela was also his nation's Abraham Lincoln. I do not exaggerate. I'll close with a story. We all know the words from President Lincoln's majestic second inaugural address, which took place right outside those doors. It was in 1865. And as he looked forward to the end of the Civil War, he turned to this war-torn nation that had lost so many in this battle that had gone on for years, and he said, quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are on." A friend would later note that Lincoln's features when he gave that address were haggard with care, tempest-tossed, and weather-beaten. But with the nightmare of the Civil War almost over, Washington, D.C. was just poised for a joyous celebration of victory. For the first time, African-American troops marched down the streets in the inaugural parade after President Lincoln gave that address, and blacks mingled with the inaugural crowd right outside here on the Capitol lawn. It was a rainy, overcast day when Lincoln gave his second inaugural address. But a friend of his noted, quote, "Just as President Lincoln stepped forward to take the oath of office, the sun, which had been obscured by rain clouds, burst forth in splendor." President Lincoln saw it. The next day, the president asked a friend, "Did you notice that sunburst? It made my heart jump." Well, the skies were also overcast the day that Nelson Mandela received the Congressional Gold Medal here in Washington. On that day, the dark bronze bust of Martin Luther King Jr. had been moved from one side of the rotunda so that Lincoln and Dr. Martin Luther King appeared to preside together over this ceremony awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to Nelson Mandela. As President Mandela started to speak, rays of sunlight began to pour into the rotunda. They illuminated the base of the statues first and then rose gradually until by the time President Mandela finished speaking, both Lincoln and King were bathed in bright sunlight. With a little imagination, you could almost hear Lincoln say, "Did you notice that sunburst? It made my heart jump." Like Lincoln, President Mandela now belongs to the ages. And while our hearts are heavy today with President Mandela's passing, the world can take inspiration from the lessons he taught us while he walked among us.